Such an interesting event to be a part of, and a really great excuse to delve into an interesting chapter in Tasmanian history. And I guess personally thinking about it and chatting about it, I was at the pub last night mentioning this event and talking about what this day means. And it was interesting talking to friends of my own age, thinking about the good and bad that we take for granted in Australian media. And sort of thinking about there's a I think it's Reporters Without Borders is the name of the organisation that has a World Press Freedom rankings, and Australia weighs in at 25th in the world in terms of different press freedoms that we do and don't have. And it was interesting comparing some notes with friends about where how that feels to be the 25th most free in the world with that. So it's been a really interesting thing to be a part of, so thank you for having me. My own careers are very varied, as all underemployed artists must just combine various different fields to make one actual career. Journalism is one that I've done very little of in terms of writing, but I have had an occasional stint working for a beer magazine, which I'm sure you will agree is a very difficult and demanding task, and one that I've taken very seriously over the years. But it has taken me some really interesting corners. I was doing a series over various years of beer travel stories. And even these, as lighthearted as the topic may be, were interesting opportunities to see how things were in different places, how media is in different countries. I remember doing one in Istanbul, which, as you may know, the trajectory of politics in Turkey has gone in a more conservative direction over the years, and Turkey doesn't rate very well on the World Press Freedom rankings. And I found it challenging to write because there were potential risks for the people I was interviewing. Criticising the legislation that did affect their industry was quite potentially it was exposing them, and also myself to some risks. Not very many, but it did cross my mind that if I was to end up languishing in an Istanbul prison for writing about IPAs, that my mum would not be impressed, and possibly wasn't the right career trajectory to go down. So having to think about that was an interesting experience, and also thinking about knowing real journalists in different parts of the world, and thinking about the courage and the resourcefulness that journalists have to show to tell stories that sometimes people in power don't want told. And that's where we trace back into Hobart's history and to the story of Andrew Bent, whose career at the helm of the Hobart Town Gazette in particular was a significant plot piece in the story of Australian press freedom. The descriptions of Andrew Bent are not very flattering. He was described as awkwardly made, a little struggler, lame, little and ugly. He seems to have had some sort of physical impediment, probably acquired in childhood. He was certainly short, and in Hobart society he was mocked for having a Cockney accent. So all of these characteristics allude to the fact that he was a man who came from the bottom of the heap, a representative of the underclass in both English and colonial society. He was born in a parish of London called St Giles in the Fields, which, although is a very pretty name, was an impoverished and overcrowded slum suburb in the centre of London. And this is just at the very end of the 1700s. And at 14 years old, he was orphaned and made a pauper. And the way things seemed to work then, the parish found apprenticeships for him and for his brothers. And Andrew Bent would wind up being apprenticed to a man named John Crowder, who was later Lord Mayor of London. But in the first decade of the 1800s, he had a newspaper called the Public Ledger. And Bent's role as an apprentice there was often described as errand boy. But he certainly learned a wider range of skills than that implies. It seems that apprentices at that time in that position would do things like pull the wet sheet off the press. They were also sometimes setting advertisements. So there were things that he learnt in that role that he would later use at the Hobart Town Gazette and in different publishing roles. But he must have felt a need to supplement his apprenticeship with additional income because he was caught attempting to sell stolen boots and clothing in a pub called the Sugarloaf on a Sunday morning. and convicted for burglary and chucked on a ship bound for Australia. And it was a ship called the Ruby that brought him into Hobart Town in the summer of 1812, which was still a very early and rather unstable time for this colonial settlement. It was a disorganised little colony, an untidy shanty town for the most part. Not too many stone buildings, quite a few wattle and daub huts. All of it mostly clustered on the waterfront, and the near starvation of the early days of the colony was still a recent memory. Rum was still currency. There were few local industries, and the landscape around Hobart would have been a source of fears, with bushrangers and the Aboriginal resistance still very strong presences. And existence here was brutal, was characterised by fear, by violence, by discomfort, by sickness, and a sense of precariousness. And I also reckon that it was characterised by quite a lot of feelings of shame. It was a class-conscious community, and for someone like Andrew Bent, I think this is a significant characteristic of his story. It was also a place where those who could would plot for positions of power, where the rules weren't set in stone, where connections and reputations accounted for more than was probably warranted. And it was also a frontier society where occasionally people could reinvent themselves and move to a new station in life. And that, I suspect, was Bent's mindset when he arrived in 1812. He was keen to take a second chance at life. And like many convicts, the path to a more amenable position was probably easier here than it would have been in London. He came to believe that by dint of his own efforts, he might be able to find himself with a better reputation, with a better, more comfortable life. And indeed, Andrew Bent would speak about the beginning of his publishing career as the time when he began to raise his head in the world. But there was a fair way to go before that could happen. From the get-go, he was assigned work in his previous field as an assistant to the convict printer George Clark, who had started the first newspaper in Van Diemen's Land, which had the very nifty title of The Derwent Star and Van Diemen's Land Intelligencer. In 1815, Bent took over that official printing position, and on May 11, 1816, he published the first edition of his Hobart Town Gazette, which is a curious publication to look at. The first edition consists mostly of a seafaring narrative written by a dubious skipper who may have supported the Gazette to try and rectify his infamy. He was in fact a smuggler of grog and runaways, and along with his illicit cargo, he brought printing materials for Bent's use. It's possibly not the best example of independent media, but that would change. And I mean, circumstances were challenging. Certainly the printing materials were much needed. When Bent began his Hobart Town Gazette, the colony had been without a newspaper for about 18 months, and the few previous efforts had been very short-lived. There were massive paper shortages, and Bent actually learnt how to make his own ink from native vegetation, I think. And he was so successful with that he ended up exporting it to the mainland. And maybe my favourite story of this situation is that his early typeset didn't have enough of the lowercase letter A. I guess it's a letter that you use quite a lot. And so some of the early publications have him just giving up and using capital letter A's towards the end as you get sort of towards the later pages in the Gazette. But I also like to think of him, I don't know if anyone's ever read Georges Perec, one of his novels he wrote without using the letter E at all. And I like to think of him, Bent really just thinking hard about how to write words that don't require the letter A whatsoever. He must have had a great vocabulary by the end of it. And of course, all of these were endorsed by Lieutenant Governor Tom Davey, who was in charge at that stage, and all publications in Australia up to that point had to have an official endorsement. So some of Bent's personality comes out in these anecdotes. I hope you agree. But I think nothing tells us more about this man than a copy of the Hobart Town Gazette, September 7, 1816, and a specific copy of it. In his own paper, Andrew Bent was able to publish the news that among the 28 convicts who had received an official pardon was the man setting the type for that edition himself. Probably the only bloke who's ever managed to publish his own pardon. But his own copy of that edition, which is in the National Library of Australia, shows this list of pardoned men with Bent's name scrubbed out so hard that he's put a rip in the page. He's really, obviously very eager to get rid of this record of his past. And less than 2 weeks later, Andrew Bent married Mary Kirk to become Mary Bent. She was a 19-year-old convict lass from Dublin, and they made a formidable team. Mary was also obviously a brave and forward-thinking individual, and their partnership was a strong one. Mary may have been quite helpful to have on board, in fact, because she would have had her own associations with the world of printing. Sort of tenuous, illicit one. She was a well-known dealer in counterfeit notes. Ended up here having been caught in a pub with a forged £5 note in her pocketbook, which was reported as being of excellent quality. So perhaps she had some skills to bring to the table as well. We'll probably never know exactly the kinds of support that Mary gave her husband. There were extensive, and there are some things that we do know, but yeah, I think she's worth recording in this story as well. And along with the Bents' personal lives, the Gazette developed slowly but significantly throughout this time. Observers noted that although it was small in size and circulation, the paper strove to exert a powerful influence for material and moral progress throughout the colony. And its early years, of course, were coinciding with a very tumultuous, eventful period in history. 1816 was the year, well, the beginning of the year, news belatedly reached Hobart Town that Napoleon had surrendered, which changed European history and in turn followed its way here with the convicts that came after the war. It was also a period in which bushranging threatened to overwhelm the whole colonial project here, in particular the work of Mike Howe, the self-proclaimed Lieutenant Governor of the Woods. That issue led to the end of Tom Davies' tenure here. Lieutenant Governor William Sorrell was next for half a dozen or so years, but the installation of George Arthur in the colony's top job marked a major change in Vandemonian politics. George Arthur was a heavy-handed authoritarian, and among the changes he instituted after his arrival was the establishment of Port Arthur. He also brought criminal executions to Van Diemen's Land, and of course implemented the Black Line, and his actions started the Black War as well. Lieutenant Governor Arthur was very wary of the political influence of the press, and he immediately had his eye on Bent's Gazette. There was instantly friction between the two men, and Arthur's whole project was about making this colony, giving its reputation back as a place that convicts didn't want to be sent. That was part of what he was instructed to do. And so he began a campaign of speaking badly about anyone who had been a convict, including those who had been pardoned. And one of Arthur's asides, directed at Andrew Bent, sums up a lot of this attitude of that period. He made a snide comment that went like this: "Mr. Bent seems to forget the situation of life in which he came to this colony." It was one of the many insults for many emancipated convicts, but for Bent, who desperately wished so much to erase that part of his life, I think that that would have affected him very personally, and I suspect was part of the reason why he responded so strongly to the authority of George Arthur. As I said, for the entirety of Australian publishing history at this stage, any work that was released had been overseen by the government. There was a government censor, an editor attached to every paper that was being put out. But that was to change. June 4, 1824, Andrew Bent made a fiercely bold move. He took the 422nd edition of the Hobart Town Gazette to print without showing the proofs to the editor. Bent had forewarned this editor, Henry Emmett, that it was going to happen. He didn't think much of Emmett. He thought him lazy and useless, essentially, is the summary of the remark he gave 2 days before he took the proofs on his own. It was in mid-afternoon that Emmett went straight to Lieutenant Governor Arthur and said that, he hadn't seen the proofs and reckoned that Bent had just gone ahead and done it without him. But it was the first example of independent, uncensored Australian media being released to the public. June 4, 1824. There was nothing subversive in that particular edition. The anti-authoritarian message was not in the articles, but it was in the way that the paper went to the public. The significance of Bent's position as an ex-convict, effectively dismissing his government-assigned editor, was not lost on colonial society. In part, what Andrew Bent had done was to undo some of the basis of that colonial structure. In bypassing the government censor, Bent was opening up accesses to power. This, of course, was hostile to the agenda of Lieutenant Governor Arthur, and for him, Bent was an example of all that was going wrong in the colony. Convicts had been treated too leniently and were starting to take some liberties that had not been permitted. So he would go hard on him, targeting for criminal libel and for breaching press licensing laws. And the latter was so obviously targeted specifically at Andrew Bent that the law that was attempted to be implemented was known as Bent's Law. In turn, Bent would appeal against the illegal and oppressive manipulations of the Lieutenant Governor's office. I think that this relationship sums up a lot of what we're thinking about when we're thinking about world press freedom. The story continues. It's quite an interesting, what happened in the aftermath of this first edition of independent media. And so much of it is around creating space for conversations around the kind of society that Van Diemen's wanted to live in. The bloke that Emmett was replaced by, the government editor, was sacked, and Bent put in a loquacious Irish immigrant by the name of Evan H. Thomas, who wrote openly about changing the structure of Van Diemen's Land, the sorts of things that were kind of unthinkable. And the influence that it had on press freedom elsewhere was also quite noticeable. Shortly afterwards, in Sydney, they began to remove government censors and make avowals of independence. Bent's press was also responsible for some of the first significant works of literature in Van Diemen's Land. Thomas Wells's 1819 pamphlet about the bushranger Mike Howe, Henry Savory's Quintus Servington, which is often described as Australia's first novel, as well as what was probably the first suppressed novel in Australia, a satire called The Van Diemen's Land Warriors. So obviously, Lieutenant Governor Arthur was aware of the embryonic possibilities ahead and saw his rule jeopardised by unmediated public discourse and open criticism of authority. But each act of censorship seems to have stirred another segment of colonial society to promote freedom of speech. And Bent, though he struggled very much and was very much put out by the way he was targeted, his career didn't pursue the heights that it might have had he not been opposed by so many authorities. He did manage to continue to stay in the publishing industry for a long time, and though reduced to limited means, he was able to publish the send-off of Lieutenant Governor George Arthur sometime afterwards in his own little publication, a raggedy little thing called Bent's News. Just a month before producing this first example of independent media in Australia, Bent published his opinion in the Hobart Town Gazette that the greatest blessing a person could enjoy was self-earned independence, achieved through honest industry. And in many ways, I still see that same spirit in today's journalistic communities, a spirit of resilience, an instinctive suspicion of authority, an ability to improvise in the face of difficult circumstances. I'll finish with a little anecdote about a place where I didn't manage to produce a beer travel piece. Iran. Not a lot of beer going around there. And I was in a tea house in the Kurdish city of Kermanshah when I saw on a televised news report that the Australian Federal Police had raided the ABC offices. Now, I'd spent some weeks in Iran already, meeting different people, hearing what it was like to live under an authoritarian government, and noted among all the other restrictions how skewed and censored their media was, how hard it was to access genuine information, how nearly impossible it made protest, and how difficult it was to manifest social change without widespread access to various opinions and interpretations of the events of the day. Now, Australia is 25th in the rankings. Iran is 174th, so it is a fair distance to go, but to watch the Australian government go in such a large step in the direction of going further down those rankings of press freedom, sitting in a place that is so heavily censored and suppressed was quite alarming and disturbing, as I'm sure you can imagine. But for me, I saw it as a storyteller, something perhaps to take on in the spirit of Andrew Bent. And I see it as a challenge for all of us as journalists, writers, musicians, as voters, to continue to find creative ways to tell the stories that are important in our times, to challenge authority, to give voice to those who are unable to speak for themselves. We may not have to brew up our own ink. Hopefully we don't have to labour so hard over the lowercase letter A's. But I believe that we can all be a part of a tradition of Australian storytellers who address important matters and tell the truth. Thank you so much for having me.